Hi there, my name is Jamie Scannell and I'm a cognitive behavioural psychotherapist working for Goldsmiths Counselling Service. What I wanted to do today is share with you a really brief, non-exhaustive introduction into panic and panic attacks. So what I aim to do today is really share with you some of the signs, some of the symptoms of panic, what it looks like, what it feels like, but also the psychology around panic from a cognitive behavioural viewpoint. The other thing I wanted to do is share with you the CBT model of panic. So in CBT, we refer to these models as formulations, and hopefully what they do is help us understand the cycle and the process of certain emotional and cognitive experiences. Now, what I wanted to mention at this point is that the ideas I'm going to draw on are a range of different concepts and theories from the work of other clinicians and researchers in the field of CBT. So to some degree, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. But the intention is really just to share some helpful information with you. As you can see, this is part one of two. So what part two is going to focus on is more how to cope with panic. So keep an eye out for that. But what I wanted to start with was an illustrative example. So imagine that a wild and dangerous animal has just padded into your room. The animal is snarling and drooling over his dinner, which just happens to be you. Now, let's pause and think about that. How would you feel? What bodily sensations would arise? What would happen to your heart rate? What would happen down in your bowels? Your heartbeat might start to quicken. This is to enable you to run or to fight. You don't need to think, so some blood drains from your brain to go to your arms and legs where it's needed, but this might make you feel a bit faint. You don't need to digest your food at this point. You need to get rid of it. So you might feel nauseous. You might need to go to the toilet. This would allow you to run faster. In fact, what you'd be in is a state of panic. So what is panic? It's an intense and visceral fear, often evoking thoughts and beliefs that something bad is going to happen. There are a multitude of physical and cognitive symptoms that accompany the feeling of panic and the experience of panic attacks. Now, a panic attack will often rise and peak very quickly, between 1 to 10 minutes. The panic may last approximately 5 to 10 minutes, although if we're triggered and re-triggered, it can undulate for much longer. But suffice to say, it can be a truly scary experience for the sufferer. An initial attack is usually described as coming out of the blue, and may not be consistently associated with a specific situation, although what we normally see is over time panics can become associated very specifically with certain situations and triggers. And it is common that an individual may experience an urge to flee to a place of safety. Now, let's think about what these symptoms consist of. So during a panic attack, your heart might race, pound, skip. You may notice you start to sweat. You may feel trembly or shake. You may experience a shortness of breath or just general difficulty breathing. There may be some choking sensations, so up in your throat perhaps. Or you can experience chest pain, pressure, discomfort. You might feel nauseous, have stomach problems, sudden diarrhea, sometimes people get. You may feel dizziness, lightheadedness, feel faint perhaps. You might get tingling or numbing sensations in parts of your body. You might experience changes in temperature, hot flushes, things like chills. But you also might feel that things around you are strange, unreal, detached, unfamiliar, a kind of dissociative sort of experience. You also might experience thoughts of losing control or going crazy, and perhaps you may even fear that you will die. So this is what's known as your threat system, otherwise known as fight or flight, a response triggered off by a very old part of our brain called the amygdala. So this is our fight or flight. Now, I don't have enough time really to go, or even the expertise to fully go into the neurology or the biochemistry of this, but I'd highly recommend you do your own research on this, so the role, the impact from an evolutionary and a biological standpoint on this part of our brain. Because if you can understand the function of the amygdala in fear and panic, it can be a good first step to understanding your experience. So when faced with a life-threatening danger, like our dangerous animal mentioned earlier, this survival mechanism is really rather useful. It's automatic and prepares the body for some kind of action. When our body responds in this manner, it is doing what it's supposed to do, prepping you for running away or for fighting. These sensations can be really uncomfortable, particularly when we do not understand why they are showing up. The difficulty we often see in our modern times is that our threat system is triggered in all kinds of different ways, even when the perceived threat is non-life threatening. So imagine, for instance, feeling as though you're on a roller coaster while prepping for an exam, or that you're being chased down by a saber-toothed tiger when you're really on your way to a party with people you've never met before. This can be confusing and overwhelming. So what I wanted to do is really try and break this down and take some power away from panic. Let's start with some typical cognitions that arise during bouts of panic. So these are very common. If these examples don't resonate with you, then perhaps spend a little time after this contemplating what really goes through your mind when you feel panic. So sometimes people experience I will collapse, I'm having a heart attack, this anxiety will kill me, I will stop breathing, I will go crazy, I will faint, I will lose control, I will die. So very scary cognitions to be having, let's be honest. So as I said, I'd invite you to take a little while to think about this from your point of view. If you've ever experienced panic or a panic attack, what goes through your mind? Now, what does a panic attack actually look like? So I wanted to share a CBT formulation with you specifically to understand the process of a panic attack. So this is Clarke's cognitive model from 1986. Now, it's a bit jargony, but I'll try and break it down. So it often talks about there being an internal trigger, but also an external trigger. So this could be a trigger from our external worlds, the world around us, but the internal trigger comes from within our minds, within our body. And this triggers off a perception of threat. So the notion of threat here is a perception of danger to the self, to our very being. And naturally, when we perceive this threat, we will feel fear, we will feel panic. That's normal, it becomes activated. Now, our emotions are heavily linked with our bodies, and there will be a multitude of other cognitive and physical symptoms that we've already touched upon. But these symptoms will lead to an interpretation which further reinforces the feelings of panic, and thus a vicious cycle is formed. This Clarke talked about as a catastrophic misinterpretation of our bodily symptoms. So that is very jargony, but essentially it's where we're misinterpreting the cognitive and physical symptoms and assuming the worst. And what this has an effect on is our belief. So our belief that something bad is going to happen, further reinforcing the vicious cycle. So let's look at a specific example. So you notice a twinge in your chest. This is the internal trigger. Perhaps you're in the gym working out. What this leads to is the perception that something is wrong. So our threat system is already active at this point, and this leads us to feel panic. Now, how would we feel in our bodies? We might notice our heart rate quickens, we have palpitations, perhaps some dizziness, start to sweat more. I mean, you've already worked out, you might be sweating already. You feel sick to your stomach, have chills, your mind starts racing with what this could be. And the interpretation, I'm having a heart attack. And let's think about that. What would that then do to the panic? It would reinforce the panic and thus conclude our vicious cycle here. But we can really look at I'm having a heart attack and be like, okay, so what is that fear? It could be that you fear you will die. Now, what I wanted to say at this point, which I think is really important to highlight here, a disclaimer of sorts, is that my assumption here is that we're dealing with a psychological difficulty. Now, obviously, if you do have a medical or health concern, or you're genuinely worried about your physical health, it's always worthwhile consulting with your GP as a first port of call. When it's established that it is in fact an anxiety-related difficulty rather than medical, then hopefully these concepts can become highly useful for you. Now, what Clark did later down the line with Wells in 1997 is he added the behavioural part of CBT. So this was to give an idea of maintenance cycles, so what actually does impact the vicious cycle that we've mentioned previously. So he added things such as avoidance and safety behaviours, and as you can see, including selective attention. So as I said, this is quite a jargony, wordy, very cognitive behavioural model. But here, when we talk about safety behaviours, these are things that we adopt in order to prevent ourselves experiencing harm or threat. So these behaviours can then impact our interpretation or our misinterpretation of these bodily symptoms. So first of all, the behaviours may increase the time and attention we put into ruminating about these experiences. So secondly, it may actually have the effect of increasing the bodily sensations. But most importantly, these behaviours, and especially the avoidances that arise, lead to a failure to disconfirm the misinterpretation. So this reinforces the belief that something is wrong and strengthening the vicious cycle once again. So as I said, I wanted to give you a further example here, but let's go back to this vicious cycle here. So you've noticed the twinge, there's something wrong, you have all these symptoms. The fear is that you will die, which increases the panic. So this is our fully formed vicious cycle in full flow. So if we go once again to this interpretation, I will die, what are the behavioural ramifications? So think about this for yourself. What might you do if you truly believed this? You might check your pulse. You might sit down as a kind of caution. You might start to monitor your bodily symptoms more or become preoccupied with monitoring the bodily symptoms. So this kind of selective attention and hypervigilance to what is going on in our bodies can inadvertently exacerbate our cognitive and physiological symptoms. So it means we end up paying even more attention to highly distressing symptoms. So they're distressing as they were, but then if we believe that we will die and we start checking our pulse and monitoring the body, it kind of reinforces that. But in the long term, it might lead to avoidant behaviours. So you might avoid exercise altogether, you might avoid the gym, you might avoid doing anything that raises your pulse because you fear that you're going to have a heart attack. And obviously long term, that's actually not good for you to not get exercise. And what it does is it fails to disconfirm this interpretation, I will die, because we're not doing anything to counter it. Now, that is essentially how we understand panic from a cognitive behavioural perspective. And I kind of wanted to leave it there because I didn't want to overwhelm or overload with different information. So hopefully that was some helpful, useful information embedded in this presentation. You feel a little more familiar with the nature of panic from a CBT perspective. So what I wanted to say is that panic can be an overwhelming experience, and it's far more common than you might realise. You know, studies have shown that in excess of 20% of the population have suffered with a panic attack. So please do not ever feel that you are alone. This experience is common. It's an unpleasant experience, but you are not the only person suffering. What I would suggest actually is perhaps take some time to consider your own experience of panic and even try and draw out this cycle so you can better understand things, maybe monitor some of the thoughts, some of the catastrophic interpretations that you may have when you feel that way. So draw it out, try and understand it, because sometimes understanding panic is half the battle. As I mentioned at the beginning, what I will focus on in part 2 will be how we cope with panic. I will share a few tips, some strategies for how best to manage panic, meaning you can hopefully move from panic to a calmer state. Stay safe. Take care.